Hi there, this is Abby with the Heirloom Farmer. This is video 2 of our Attainable No-Dig Garden series. If you did not see video 1, I highly recommend you go back and watch that video first. Otherwise, this isn't going to make a whole lot of sense. If you did watch that video, welcome back. This is the video where we are going to select our 4x8 garden location. And I do want to take a moment to talk about the time frame. So this video is coming out the last week of March, so the end of March, and the idea with these videos is that you can garden along with me. So you really want to be doing the steps of the video series as they come out. So you want to do this part of the process in early spring. And to do a no-dig garden method like we're going to do, you really want to get this started as early in the spring as you can. The benefit to this is those really nice days where you want to be outside, but it's too early to plant anything. Well, you can get started with your no-dig garden, and that's what we're going to do. If you're watching this video at a different time of year, it is still possible to start your garden. There just might be some additional considerations that you will need to adjust depending on the time of year. So if you're starting at a different time of year, let me know. I can help you out with some tips on how to get started depending on the time of year. But ideally, you want to do this in the early spring, March or April, early April, ideally. All right, so as I mentioned, I want this to be a garden along type video series, so I hope that you will do this part of the process along with me, which means you need a few things. So you're going to need a tape measure or measuring stick, something to measure out the 4x8 foot garden space. And then you're going to need something to mark out the four corners of the plot. You can use stakes, you can use sticks. It doesn't really matter. This is temporary. You just want something that's gonna stay in place until next week when we do the next part of this process. I'm going to use rocks because we have a lot of rocks around here and I know they're not gonna move. So that's what I'm marking out the four corners of my plot with. The next thing you want to do is select your site. So there are a couple key considerations for site selection, and you do want to select a good site. This will set you up for success. Now, I also don't want you to stress about selecting the perfect location, right? Don't stress over this to the point of not getting started. Just take these considerations into fact and pick a location, all right? You really do want full sun. Full sun is 8 or more hours of direct sunlight a day. So as you can see, I'm out here. There's nothing around to block the sunlight. This is definitely going to get 8 hours of sun a day, probably a lot more than that. But if you have a lot of trees or buildings in the area, you're going to want to look and see how much sunlight does that spot get each day, and is it at least 8 hours? There's a lot of ways you can do this, but why not just spend all day out in your yard looking to see where the sun is? But yes, really, just look at your yard, look at your space. If you have a space in mind, kind of look at it throughout the day to get an idea of how much full sun it's getting, and aim for something that's getting 8 hours of full sun. You do want a site that is fairly flat, no dramatic sloping. Although again, I know we're in Pennsylvania, there's a lot of slopes, but aim for something fairly flat and level and that has good drainage. So how do you know if it has good drainage? Well, you just don't want to choose a spot that has standing water regularly, or if you look at it and there's like a dip where you can see there's been a puddle and nothing grows, you want to avoid that. If we've gotten rain and a day or two later there's still standing water, you really want to avoid those spaces. You also want to avoid any space that has excess rocks or rubble or debris. So as you know, as we mentioned last week, you really want to look for a nice lawn space, so where there's grass or clover or annual weeds. You don't want anything that has perennials or rocks or stumps, things like that. Now again, I don't want to overcomplicate this, but you want to make sure and take some of these things into consideration when you select your site. If you have more questions about selecting your site, let me know. But we are going to look at the site that I've selected, and we're going to mark out our plots. We'll talk about a few other considerations while we do that. The last thing I want to say for now, though, is wildlife. So with this garden project, we are not building a fence around our garden. This is something that's optional, and if you're really concerned about critters munching on your garden, you may want to add a fence. You will actually see I have a fence behind me for our other garden. And that might be something to consider. However, for this garden, I want to keep it as simple as possible, so we're not doing a fence. What that means, though, is with your site selection, you might want to choose a place that's closer to your house or closer to where there's a lot more activity, like where your kids play nearby, that the wildlife is less likely to frequent. You know, whereas somewhere far from your house that there's very few visitors to, there might be more wildlife. So just something to keep in mind with your site selection. All right, I'm going to turn the camera around and we are going to mark out our garden plot. Okay, so we are going to mark out our 4 by 8 foot garden bed. And that's all there is to it. So you can put it whatever direction works for your space. I know that we are going to want to mow around ours, so I'm going to make sure that where I position it, there's plenty of room on all sides for our mower to go around, so that's something to consider. Otherwise, I am going to mark out our 4 by 8 foot garden plots and use my rocks. Now, this does not have to be exact, so you know, don't worry about it too much, but you do want to get a fairly, you know, square 4 by 8 foot space. But again, it doesn't have to be exact. This is just so that we have an approximate size, so that we know how much compost we need, how many plants we can plant, and have some consistency. That is it. We have our garden space marked out. I realize you can't see it super well in this video, so I will take you over to where you can see the garden space a little bit better. We have our 4 by 8 foot garden space in the grass marked out. And that's all we are doing for this week, except for gathering supplies for next week. So let me get you situated here so we can talk about what you need to do to get ready for next week. But that was easy, right? Like, we've got our garden site marked out. It was that quick and that simple, and we are ready to get started actually preparing our garden bed next week. So let me know if you have any concerns or questions about selecting your site. Otherwise, we are going to move on next week to actually creating the garden bed. So for next week, you're going to need your hay, straw, or leaves, depending on what you chose. You're going to need your compost, and you're going to need your cardboard or your newspaper, again, depending on what you chose and what you have access to. So cardboard and newspaper, straw, hay, or leaves, and compost. If you have questions about finding any of those things or getting them ready for next week's video, let me know. I'm happy to answer any questions, but we will actually be applying those to our marked out garden space next week so that we can get started gardening. This is going to be really exciting. And that's it. Like I said, this is super simple, super attainable, and if you have any concerns, if you think, yeah, but let me know what that is so that we can talk about some solutions. All right, thank you, and God bless.